as well. All right. Wonderful. Welcome, everybody, to our virtual roundtable on storytelling and publishing. My name is Eileen Corcoran. I'm the Director of Service and Outreach at the Vermont Historical Society, and excited to have you here today. So just a couple of quick things. I think many of you are familiar with VHS already, but if not, please visit our website at vermonthistory.org or follow us on social media, including Facebook and Instagram. And then I'd also, most all of you are either on our local history e-newsletter list or will be signed up after via your registration. And we also do have a local history listserv that I will pop that link into the chat as well, that we're happy to have people join so we can continue learning and sharing with each other. And so today I'm super excited actually to have two wonderful folks on this roundtable with me today. Both gentlemen work for and with VHS and are wonderful and amazing folks who have a lot of information on publishing, storytelling, books, all sorts of good stuff here today. And I'm going to let them introduce themselves. And I don't know if anybody prefers to go first, but I'm going to call on Andrew because he's unmuted. So Andrew Liptak.
Hi, I'm Andrew Liptak. I am the guest services and PR coordinator for the Vermont Historical Society. I am also a published author. I wrote a book that came out in 2022, and I have long spent time as a journalist and specifically covering books. And even way before that, I worked as a bookseller at the now defunct Walden Books and the not defunct Bear Pond Books here in Montpelier. My role here at the Historical Society is to promote all of our programming, our publications, and I also run our bookstore. So what I'm going to be talking about a little bit later alongside Alan is what it looks like from where I sit as a bookseller. And that includes everything from how do we think about selling the book once you've written it, to some of the more tedious public relations stuff, like how do you do press outreach, how do you the importance of having a good cover, the packaging, and thinking of this not just as a project that you have spent a lot of loving time on, but also as a product that you want to get into people's hands and to reach as many readers as possible. So that's sort of where I'm going to be coming at this from.
Thanks, Andrew. So I'm Alan Berolzheimer. I have a background in both history and publishing, and I got hired by VHS in 1998, so 25 years ago now, to manage the book publishing program. And over that time, I've shepherded the publication of 20 titles with VHS, reviewed and evaluated scores and scores of proposals and submissions, and seen a lot of changes in the publishing industry over that time. I've had a lot of contact over the years with folks from towns and local historical societies that are interested in publishing locally focused work. And I've done a lot of various kinds of freelance editorial and publishing work over the years as well. So I think my role is to serve as a resource for questions about really the nuts and bolts of how to go about writing and publishing a book. And really happy to be here to hang out with all you guys today. And it's really nice to see Tortoise Isselhart on the screen. Tortoise served for several years on the VHS Publications and Research Committee, and we had a lot of fun working together back in the day. So hi, Tortoise.
Yes. So I don't know, again, anybody's welcome if you have a question to start off with to either Alan and or Andrew. Otherwise, I'll sort of kick some things off. And Andrew, I know you had a bunch of things you were thinking about talking about, but you did mention books and book publishing, but I think one of the really other things that might be applicable to a lot of the folks here is you also edit and sort of manage our newsletter. So any kind of tips that you might have for folks when they're doing their newsletters?
Yeah, so the newsletters that we do falls under the broader context of public relations. And how I view this is, how do we communicate what we are doing, not only the events and the programming and the publications that we do, but how do we communicate the idea of Vermont history and sort of further our mission through outreach. So that includes newsletters, includes social media, it includes sometimes printing up posters and sticking them on the street. So those are all elements of public relations. For the newsletter, what we do, I write and edit History Happenings, which is our biweekly newsletter from VHS. It goes out to our wider. Someone wants to hit mute just so we don't have a hearing echo. Sorry, it throws me off a little bit. Where was I? Our newsletter goes out bi-weekly, and we use that to cover everything from, hey, this is an event that we have coming up. This is, we're actually going to be sending one out tomorrow. That is happy birthday, Ethan Allen, because it was the anniversary of his birth earlier this week. When we have new books coming out, we talk about those. We have events and just everything sort of in between. One of the favorite things I like to do with that newsletter is author interviews. We have a whole bunch of Vermont authors who have published books in the last year. And typically when I hear about that happening, I'll get in touch with them and sort of say like, hey, do you want to do a quick interview about how did you write this book? How did, what resources did you use from VHS? What was the process of writing it like? How did you find the right bit of the right angle on the story? And those I always find really enlightening and hopefully useful for our readers, because that sort of pulls the curtain back a little bit on the publishing process and on the writing process. And I think it's a really useful thing for our readers to do. Along the same lines, we do have this sort of the same approach with social media and other things like that. We'll post up pictures, we'll post up things about Vermont's history, and obviously our publications as well, and try to spread the word when those are coming up. And we'll have one later. I wouldn't be doing my job if I didn't insert a little bit of PR here. We do have a new book coming out later this spring about Ira Allen. And we don't have any information about that yet, but we will soon, so stay tuned. And our most recent one, it's kind of blurry, Vermont for the Vermonters. It's a history of the eugenics movement in Vermont, and that came out last fall, and we were pretty excited about it. So yeah, those are the newsletter is just one way that we can provide outreach to our supporters and members and followers. Any questions?
Glenn.
I see a read.
Oh, gotta unmute yourself, Glenn. There we go.
Yeah, thank you. Does the Vermont Historical Society itself publish books, or are all these books published by a different publisher and presented by the society?
Yeah, that's a great question. We are an independent publisher. We have a line of books that we publish ourselves, and that's what Alan does. As the bookstore person, I am responsible for making sure, we can't publish every book that comes out. We only have a small staff to do that. But there are other books that come out all over the place about Vermont's history. Some of these are locally published or independently published from local authors. Sometimes they come from big major presses or smaller indie presses or academic presses. And my job at the bookstore is to sort of troll through the internet and Amazon and Barnes Noble and Edelweiss and sort of see like what books are out there that make sense for us to carry at the VHS bookstore here in Montpelier and on the online store that we have. So in some cases, it's opening up accounts with some of the bigger book vendors out there, like Ingram, or with a dedicated account for a publisher. I'm trying to think of off the top of my head of who we've opened accounts with. U.S. Naval Institute Press just published a book about George Dewey. So we have an account with them, and we will order books as we run low on those. Arcadia, which is the sort of they produce the sepia-toned local history books for all over the country. We order quite a few books from there. That sometimes local historical societies write, sometimes local scholars write. And in other cases, it's sometimes the author walking into the bookstore and saying like, hey, I have these books. Would you like to take a look at them? We've bought a couple that way as well. So yeah, it's basically, the answer is yes. We have a whole range of ways that we do to sell them, and I would say, I'll put a caveat in here, is that selling the book is not always necessarily like it's not the same category as we are publishing it. I try to have a wide range of things for folks to do. So there's some books that are a little bit more like touristy oriented or kid oriented, like Champion Me by the Maple Tree is not really a historic book, but it's good for grandparents to pick up for their kids as they come through the museum store and things like that. So we try to get a good range of books and products for the folks who come through the doors here.
And Alan, did you want to talk a little bit about sort of the VHS publication process?
Yeah. So I would just start by saying that as an independent publisher, Vermont Historical Society goes back, at least 100 years, if not more. We used to publish the proceedings of meetings, and the Vermont History Journal has been around for many, many years as well. I think these days our publishing program is probably in about the most active phase that it's ever been, and in part that's because the revolution in digital technology has really made it easier for small and really non-commercial publishers like us to make a go of it. It's not that expensive to publish a book relative to what it cost to publish a book 20 years ago, let's say. So our process is typically people come to us and say, hey, I have this manuscript, or I have this idea for this book that I'm interested in working on. Might you be interested in publishing it? And so we start really with a proposal, an overview, sometimes a sample chapter. Occasionally somebody will give us an entire manuscript that they've written. And we take the time. I'm usually the first point of contact, and I'll read through a proposal, a manuscript, and decide whether I think it belongs on our list of books. We have criteria that we use to evaluate whether we would be a good publisher for a particular book. The basics have to do with, does this make some kind of significant contribution to the public's understanding of Vermont history? Is it something, a lot of times, and this is relevant to you folks, people approach us about publishing local histories, and typically we don't publish a local history because our interest is in serving the entire state. And so you would have to make a good case to us that the material contained in your book is really has interest and significance beyond your local community, that it sheds light on broader aspects of state and national history. But in any event, so we'll evaluate a manuscript. We used to have a publications committee, and now we have an editorial board. So I have a group of advisors that work with me to assess a project and answer those various questions. Marketability always is one of the things we ask. Is this a project that we think we could sell enough books to recoup the cost of what we need to invest in order to, get a book printed and out to the public? And we usually, if we're interested in a project, then we engage in quite a deliberative, drawn-out conversation with an author. We'll typically ask for revisions of some sort or another. So there'll be some back and forth. And so we really try to do a very determined and intensive kind of work professionally to get a manuscript, a text of a book, up to a point where we think it's really representative of the highest quality of publishing. And then we go through an entire production process as well, editing, proofreading, indexing, design, taking a manuscript from a Word file to an actual designed book, and then printing. So there's a lot of steps in the production process that we go through once we've decided, yes, this is something we want to publish and bring into our house. Questions?
I have a question.
Oh, sorry.
Go ahead.
I just was wondering if you have what your printing options are. Do you go out every time? Do you have one relationship, or do you have a handful of relationships with printers?
I would say that, over early on when I started in this job back in the late 90s, there wasn't any such thing as digital publishing, and printing was all done on offset presses. Today, there are a lot of printers out there that do digital printing, which for the quality that we're looking for is plenty good, plenty sufficient. And it's much cheaper for the most part than offset printing. So I have a small handful of printers that I typically will quote a book with. And there's one or two that I have found over the years do really high quality work. They have really good customer service. They're affordable. And so I typically feed books to one or two printers. But there's lots out there. And for those of you who are thinking about publishing books, and if you find that you're not able to connect with an actual publisher of some sort or another, many of you probably know that there are various platforms available today, like through Amazon's Kindle Direct Publishing program, through Ingram Spark, where you can essentially upload files to a platform and have books designed, or you can get templates to do the design work yourself, and then upload books to these platforms, and the book will be available. You can order a certain number of copies, and then the book would be available as a print-on-demand product out there in the world for people to find through Amazon and Barnes & Noble and other book-selling platforms.
Since you
One
mentioned
thing that
I'm
I'm just going to jump in real quick with the thing about Amazon is, especially if you're a local author and you're hoping to get books into like a local indie bookstore, Amazon, a lot of indie bookstores won't pick up books that are published exclusively on Amazon, even if you are, next door to them or you've been a loyal customer. A lot of these stores see these as sort of an existential threat to their business model, and there's it's always worth looking around at the options that you have available in the marketplace. Ingram Spark is where a lot of bookstores will draw their stock from. It's also worth looking at the rates and the contracts as what's the fine print when you go and try to print up a book through these types of services. And I know I've known of a lot of folks in the history world and in the non-fiction or world they've printed up books, or they've signed with an Amazon publisher, and they've found that it's impossible to get a local bookstore to hold an event for them or to sell that. So that's just one thing to sort of keep in mind as you go through this process. Is just it might work really well for you. I don't want to say that it's not it's a bad option. It might be the best one you have, but it's certainly, I would say it's always worth making sure you're not just looking at the first stop when you're doing your search, and see what other options there are out there.
That definitely a good piece of advice. The follow-up question that I had related is even more narrow, and that is, I used to use the print-on-demand system at Harvard Bookstore, which was awesome. And it disappeared, and it used a specific machine that only like a handful of people have. Apparently there's one in St. Johnsbury. Has anybody use that. You basically just give them the properly, as Alan was saying, properly formatted PDF, and they can print it off, cover and all.
I want to say that that's called rail and box or boxcar books.
That's it, yeah.
Yeah,
But,
I'm pretty sure also that Northshire Bookstore in Manchester
Oh, they do.
has a print on demand platform as well. Yeah.
That's very
Phoenix
cost
Books.
effective.
Phoenix Books in Burlington also has one called Onion River Press, and they're it's the same sort of thing.
Well, the print on demand that Harvard had, in which hopefully these other two places have, are at North Shore and Rail and Boxcar, whatever that is, are you can literally print a single copy very inexpensively as long as you have your own formatted book. So I think the Onion River Press is a little more conventional, that you have to
Yep.
do a whole setup thing and buy a certain quantity. And so that's, I'm not interested in that, just not just for putting together something that I would publish, but also there are a ton of things I would love to have a print copy of that PDF is already available for.
Great. I think
See-
Glenn had a question, and then Niles has his hands up as well.
Well, I was just wondering if the Historical Society publishes a book, is it marketed, or is it just sold? Is it sold just at the Historical Society bookstore?
Andrew can talk about that.
I could talk all about that. Yes, we do a lot of marketing for our books. I came into this role in March 2022, and we were, I think the first book out of the gate for me was Vermont for the Vermonters. So how I as I said before, my background is in the whole variety of the book world. I worked as a bookseller at Walden Books and Bear Pond Books. I'm pretty fluent in digital media and press relations. So there's a lot of things that we do for books once we pick them up and publish them. The first thing is one of the things, the projects that I put together when I was coming into this role was I made a list of all the indie bookstores here in Vermont. And I actually just added a book to it, which is pretty exciting. We have about 60 books throughout the state that and some of the around the edges in New Hampshire, New York, and Massachusetts. I have all their emails and phone numbers and addresses, and I email them a couple times a year saying like, hey, these are the books that we have. What would you like to buy? I put together a sales catalog that lists all of the books that we currently have available, and blast that out to them and basically say like, this is what we have. Here are the rates that we'll sell them to you at. We provide a wholesale rate for certain numbers, and then we'll pick up orders from them. Based off of that, as well, we have our own bookstore. So we sell books here at the museum store in Montpelier. We have a handful of copies of each at the History Center in Barrie, and we have an online store that I run it's run on our sales platform Square. And that goes up online. I make sure that's updated with whatever we have in stock. We sort of put our own books. We have sections for our own books. We have make sure that we're prominently talking about our stuff on there. And when it comes to actually doing the advertising for Vermont for the Vermonters, we didn't actually do any paid advertising for the book. It was all sort of just we're relying on press outreach and social media stuff. But we did a lot of stuff on social media, from Facebook posts about our with the cover, with the various social networks that we use. We did an interview with Mercedes de Guardiola on our newsletter, and we also made sure to boost any links that we might have had for reviews that came out or interviews that came out. We had interviews in a bunch of different newspapers and places throughout the state. On top of all that, I have a press list that I've put together. So I basically tracked down as many press emails as I could find from Vermont outlets and local regional outlets. And we basically messaged them about the book when it was coming out. And we're getting ready to do that for this upcoming Ira Allen book. Part of how this whole process worked is we put together a publicity plan in advance. So we knew we had a series of steps and a roadmap to follow. And basically what that entails is, we have the book cover, and we have the plot description and the sales details. We'll message that out to the bookstores saying like, hey, this book is, we try to give them as much notice as we can, because they have to sort of plan ahead and figure out their budget for how many books are they going to buy, what is the projected demand and things like that. So we message them ahead of time. It's like, here's what we've got, this is what's coming up. For the Ira Allen book, we're going to be talking a lot about events and trying to get Kevin out to as many of these bookstores and historical societies as we can, so he can talk about it, and people can hear from him directly about it. After that, we basically identify what outlets are best for this, to talk about this. So we sort of hit the high profile ones like Vermont Public and 7 Days and whatnot. And then we keep going forward and message local towns when we have events in those communities. If there are places that are pertinent to that book's plot, or we will message them and try to highlight that local angle. We have good relationships with a whole bunch of television stations. So when Mercedes came up for the book release last year, we were able to get a couple of interviews with her and basically helped get the word out through media as we could, as we could find it, and as they were willing to give us time and space on those publications. So there's a lot of different things that we can do there to help market the book. I think with Ira Allen, I think we've allocated a little bit of money for paid advertising on Facebook and some other places. We'll see. We'll be doing a little bit of experimentation with that and see what works. But in a lot of cases, it's just trying to tell as many people about the book as we can. And another part of that is also events. So we will have some events with Kevin. We have a couple coming up with Mercedes. If you're in the Manchester, Vermont area, there'll be a book event with her in February, and we'll have another one in March, and a couple more throughout the year. So I think did that answer your whole question, Glenn?
Great, thanks. I think Niles had his hand up, and then Tortoise and Joanna.
Thank you. Yeah. So Alan, so you talked a bit about, and I'm sorry if I missed something, but so you talked about reviewing manuscripts. Do you also take in book proposals and review them and work with a proposal, or are you more looking at finished or draft manuscripts?
Sure. We often start with a proposal. Somebody might reach out and say, would you be interested in this? And then I'll say, yeah, write me a proposal, give me an overview of the book, maybe a sample if you have some writing done. Because we're a small publisher and we only have, limited funds to invest in publishing, we have to be very selective about what we take on. And so we don't generally make a commitment to publish a book until we've seen and reviewed an entire manuscript. So somebody might send a proposal and I might decide, you know what, I just don't think the group is going to be interested in this. I might decide, and then I won't even share it. We get enough inquiries that I have to be a screen of some sort. But I'd say more often than that, a book will be of some level of interest to me, and my expectation would be that our editorial board would want to think about this. And if that's the case, and even sometimes when it's not the case, my main responsibility there is to encourage you and say, yeah, this seems like a worthy project. We might be interested in taking it on. We can't really judge that until we've seen a manuscript. But yeah, this seems like a worthwhile topic. Go for it, do the work, and let's see where it goes. And I try to remain available to work with people along the way as questions come up, reviewing interim writing, whatever kind of guidance I can provide, I'm interested in doing.
For what it's worth, he rejected a book from me a bunch of years ago, so he's very selective.
Great, Tortoise.
Yeah, hi, Alan. As I explained to Alan, I was listening right along, but the roofer that was doing work has just this minute left, having signed and gotten a check from me. So now I can speak up. I have not written any of the books. There were 28 books in all that Images from the Past has published. And Arcadia was mentioned. Well, Applewood Books was our distributor. Arcadia bought them and then chose not to be our distributor anymore. So I am again, with all the inventory, the opportunity and the challenge of connecting with buyers and the outlets of people that I used to do business with. I guess my one question, and it's great to see Andrew here. I also watched when he was talking about cosplaying, that my question to him, which I think would be good for everybody, is how you like to be contacted. I have some books that where there is an outside event. They're old books, but the honor of command of the Burgoyne campaign relates to the 250th that's going to be celebrated. The history of the Irish in Vermont is, coming up for St. Patrick's Day. So what I'd like to do, and have to remember now, 10 years later, how people like to be contacted and how often, to not annoy the Vermont Historical Society and Andrew, but just, a gentle nudge some way. And that's sort of a big thing. And I'll put a link to our glorious new website in the chat as well. But Andrew, how would you like me to get to you?
Yeah, it's a great question, and we have vendors from all over the place that get in touch in a whole variety of ways. Sometimes we've had salespeople come up in person. For me personally, email is best, just because I am usually either here at the History Museum, I'm over at the Vermont History Center in Barrie, or working from home, or I'm out at the front desk or out in the museum somewhere. So email's always easiest for me. But I would say it's never really an annoyance when somebody gets in touch saying, like, as a salesperson, we have these products that we would like you to consider. And on our side, what we're always doing is we're looking at what books we have in stock, what has sold really well, what doesn't sell very well, or what moves slowly. And we sort of make determinations based on that. So I can only speak for like what our store does. We have we do sell stuff that is, let me back up for a second. I split the store up into a couple different categories. One is our own books. We have a shelf dedicated to VHS publications, which we always have. We have a growing shelf for children's publications. And then from the non-VHS books, we have what I've divided up into Vermont history, like histories about the larger story of Vermont, biographies, things like that, or statewide histories that are not really fixed to a location. I have a section for military history because we have an outsized number of those. We have a shelf of books for of local history. So these are I'm more interested in selling books that are basically around the central Vermont area, just because that's where we get most of our tourists traffic from. We have a couple books from places like Bennington, but they're sort of a little bit more about like the Battle of Bennington, things like that. And then we have a like food recreation and like transportation and sort of tourist guides sort of things. So as much as I would like to have every single book about Vermont's history on the shelves, we don't have that just because we have a limited number of space. We have to account for our inventory and make sure that what we are buying is also being moved off the shelf quicker than it's sitting. We don't want to have product on shelf that's sitting for years and years. We want to make sure that it's moving off. So I try to make a determination for like what makes the most sense for us to sell. The big overarching criteria there is Vermont history. We do get quite queries from folks who are asking about novels or memoirs, and I'm a little bit more picky when it comes to those because we don't have a ton of novels. They don't tend to sell all that well, but sometimes we have a couple that we'll make an exception for. We try to find the really hyper local stuff. We try to make sure it's Barrie, Montpelier, Northfield, some Burlington, because we have a lot of tourists who are coming down from the Burlington area. things like that. That's sort of how we go about that. And we do take a look for, like here at the store, I do try to pull stuff out and try to highlight things seasonally as it makes sense. Right now we have a shelf that is all books about ski history. So I've pulled out, I think I have 5 books right now that are all about ski history. So anybody who comes to the museum's store is going to see that. And, you know, if they're coming in for Stowe or Sugarbush or wherever, they might walk away with something like there. Ethan Allen's birthday was the other day. If we were open, I would have put up a display of all of our Ethan Allen books, things like that. Like I try to make sure that they're highlighted, and every now and then we'll do a social media post of, you know, like, hey, you know, it's Ethan Allen's birthday. Here are 5 or 6 books that we have that you can take a look at. We'll be doing that in our newsletter tomorrow. And that's basically how the sales tempo here goes. Is, you know, we're always trying to make sure that we make a decision to buy books that we are pretty sure will do pretty well with our audience. And sometimes we will have a book that will surprise us, and it'll do really well. Gary Aubin had a book that came through the door that I had not heard of called The History of Town Bands in Vermont, and we decided to give it a shot, and we sold a whole bunch. A lot of people really liked the history of learning about the history of town bands. Paul Hiller's Greenmount Cemetery was another one that did really well for us because it was local. There's a lot of interest because he's a local author, and it's just sort of just down the street from us. So I think that did quite well. And of course, our other books, Discovering Black Vermont is a pretty good seller for us. Vermont for the Vermonters is a pretty good seller. Those are both fairly new, but they're also topics that there's a lot of other interest around this area of Vermont history and just history in general. Both these books provide a pretty nuanced look at these topics, and they are books where we are, you know, sort of tapping into that larger discussion that's going on in the world. Is what's the sort of hidden histories types of things that are becoming more and more popular as more scholars really turn a critical eye to them. And I think that's a really good thing. It's a very valuable thing for historians to do for their community. So.
Great, thanks. Joanna.
Hi, so Andrew kind of answered this question already. I was wondering about historical fiction. So you did kind of answer that question, because I'm researching and writing a novel right now that's kind of based on Rutland, but it's going to incorporate how in the context of the whole state. So I just kind of, your criteria, I guess, would be the question for you to even consider historical fiction.
But whenever I get a book in that we haven't really seen, that's sort of coming in cold, we will try to give it a read over and to sort of see like how readable is it? Is it a story that seems interesting to our readers, our members, our buyers? And all of these things are subjective. I'm one person. I've had other folks here at the museum sort of take a look at books every now and then just to sort of see what they think. I think for selling like a historical fiction, it's a harder sell just because we have limited space. We only have a certain amount of shelf space. We have other books that will probably sell better, so it's sort of just making that calculation there. That's not, we're also not the end all and be all of Vermont history books. Although I think just about every one of these bookstores that we talk to has a Vermont section, and a lot of them hold these types of books. And there's some books out there that have done quite well. Eric Pope's, I think, is it Granite Kingdom that came out last year, or the year before. That's not one we've thought about picking up, but it's just, again, sort of space and mission focus for us. Let me see. I think I'm trying to think if there's other novels that we've picked up over the time. We have our own 7 Years of Grace, which we have lots of copies of that it never quite sold very well. So I think that's sort of also institutionally we're a little bit wary of picking up books. One we do have is Daniel Mills's Moria, which is a sort of a spiritualist book, not quite horror, but it's we picked that up because we got a pretty good deal on it, and it sort of made sense around sort of the Halloween area, sort of the fall spooky-ish season type thing. And we sold a couple copies, but it's also quite a small book, so it doesn't take up as much shelf space. we did just get a novel in the other day that I actually ended up sending back because the terms on the book were not conducive for us. They wanted about $30 per paperback, which means that we would have to price it quite a bit higher. It was also quite thick, and it didn't really look like it was a very appealing for folks. So that was just a combination of factors that said it's not quite for us. And if we reject the book, it's also not really like we're not trying to make a statement about the quality or try to ding you for it. It's more of it doesn't quite work for us. So if you have a novel, by all means, feel free to send it our way. It might be a slightly higher bar for us to sell here, but that said, there's also lots of other options to sell locally. And we, if I do see like an event coming up for when we do our events roundup for the newsletter, I'll throw those into make sure that we're trying to promote anything that has to do with Vermont history as it comes out. So.
Great. Tortoise had another comment or question.
Yeah, actually, this is a comment about how things have changed in publishing over the years, and what Andrew has been describing about how he monitors what's happening, how the technology that makes that possible to track things. And I think back, Alan, to when I was with the publication, and this is also a comment about how the Historical Society has changed, because at that time, publications were because somebody should publish it. And, it deserves to be out there without a thought of exactly what the market was or how you could get to the market. There wasn't any social media. And so I really love seeing and having to and being able to take advantage of the ways to get the word out, to show people what things are, to tempt them a little bit, because the competition is just extraordinary. Yeah, the self-publishing, it was that was a black mark if something was self-published.
Right.
And now it's the major. So I am not, I may yet publish one more book. Vince Feeney has a possible book that he may let me publish. He did the Burlington book and the history of the Irish in Vermont, but otherwise just so authors don't get their hopes up. We're based down in Bennington, and the books stand the test of time, but don't get your hopes up, as Andrew mentioned about historical fiction, that we're not soliciting manuscripts anymore. So thank you for doing this. This is fascinating.
One thing that this sort of comes from my experience as working as a journalist, is something that was hammered into me from a fairly early part of my career, was to always try to think of the right angle for a book. So if you're thinking about writing some sort of Vermont history or any type of book, is what is the what is the thesis? What is the thesis of the book? What is the angle that you are trying to hook your reader with? And in some cases, it's I always like to sort of lead with to suggest to folks that you find something that is compelling, that is relevant, that you can make connections to the modern day, and that doesn't. My journalism experience doesn't always really hook onto the historical society stuff, but I think there's a lot of parallels there, in that you can find really compelling local story, or really compelling Vermont story, and tell it in such a way that it is engaging, it is accessible, and it is interesting to a wide range of people. So I always try to keep your audience in mind. And what I try to tell our staff when we're doing our newsletters, our History Connections magazine, think our audience is not necessarily all folks who have PhDs in history. They are folks who have a general interest or just a passing interest, and we want to make sure that we're not leaving them out with something that's very sort of archaic or that will sort of they'll pick up, read a couple pages, and this is not for me. So I always try to think of your audience as you're putting a plot together or a story together.
Great. Cindy has a hand up.
Sort of piggybacking on Andrew's comments, I think that when we the Moncton Historical Society published Well, two things in the last couple of years. One was just a walking tour guide for one of our walkable areas. And then our intention was to publish a book or booklet about each of the 4 boroughs here in Moncton. And the one we started with was East Moncton. And we published that last June. It's about 60 pages or so. But the thing that we were really struggling with is really saying, okay, who is our audience going to be? And what is the story that we are trying to tell? And that's why the title of this roundtable that talked about was storytelling and publishing was intriguing to me, because I think particularly for a local history, which has a pretty narrow interested audience, really trying to get a handle on what will be interesting and to whom, and what will be consumable to a wide audience. Particularly, we're trying to interest younger audiences as well as adults. So these are all things that we struggled with. Hopefully we hit the right balance, but it's kind of interesting as you kind of talk through those issues and try to figure out the answers.
Yeah, I completely agree.
If I could just follow up on what Cindy was just saying, I do want to emphasize that in spite of everything I said about the fact that VHS is very selective in what we choose to publish, I strongly encourage and welcome you to get in touch with me with any kinds of questions that you have. I really feel like part of my job, part of my responsibility is to be out there as a support resource for the broad Vermont history community. There are lots of ways to tell stories. There are lots of ways to make your work and your stories accessible to the public, including all digital presentation as opposed to actually printing hard copies of books. I think that's a really viable path that a lot of people can consider. So I just want to emphasize that I am available to to help you think through options about what you might do with the projects that you're working on. And
that's really helpful. And we ended up, so we printed just 100 copies of our little book, but we also made it free on our website as a PDF.
Yeah, great idea.
And it looks really nice on the website. So, but in spite of the fact that it's available for free, we've sold about 80 copies of our 100 books that we printed.
That's really good.
That's great.
Yeah.
One thing I would toss onto the sort of tail end of some of those thoughts is that presentation is always also a really big thing, at least for me. You have to keep in mind that if increasingly folks are looking at books on a digital storefront, they might just see it as a thumbnail. They might just, if they're in the bookstore, they might have to, a book cover has to sort of capture their attention, and it's usually worth checking with somebody checking with a designer, checking with somebody to put something together that will capture the interest. That will sort of says telegraph something about the book to the reader, and really sort of captures their attention. We had a lot of ideas for Vermont for the Vermonters that actually Mercedes, our author, actually ended up putting a couple suggestions in that made it through to the final one, which is sort of a mock family tree. It's sort of very minimalist, and it's pretty striking, and it worked quite well. I think as we put together some revisions, it popped really, really nicely. There's also, I think there's also something to be said. Like we've had books that have come through that folks have wanted to sell that are basically double spaced, size 12 times the Roman drafts that have been printed up locally. And I would encourage folks to think about how these books might fit in the ecosystem of a bookstore. A book that has a large font and double space, that takes up a lot of paper. And in a couple of cases, we've had books where we have not been able to sell because the printing costs for each copy was prohibitively expensive, $30-$40, and we need to be able to make a profit in the bookstore justify carrying it. So it's worth, reaching out to a designer, I think, especially if you wanted to, look really nice and have people who will pick it up who are not, sort of outside the immediate orbit of a historical society or outside your immediate friend circle. In cases where we've had people who've submitted like books that are like, double spaced, like, well, if you shrink that down, you will cut your cost in half because you've got all this dead space that you've pulled out. So I think that's something to sort of take into consideration, is like, how does the final product look? And do you have designers in the historical society or in your community that would be willing to lend you a hand? We use Mason Singer for the History Connections newsletter, and he does a phenomenal job. And I know there's lots of others out there that would well be worth the effort of chatting with to really make it look like make the finished product look really, really nice. So.
Allison has a hand up. Here she is.
Hi, I'm actually at the Historical Society bookstore right now, volunteering today. And I am not an author, but I am an avid reader. And I read a lot of local Vermont history, local history. And one of the things I noticed is there can be vast differences from one publication to the next. And this might be a question for Alan, I'm not sure, about editing and proofing. And do authors have different contracts where there's different levels of services offered, where it's just up to them to make sure to get it right? Or does the publisher have any kind of input on suggestions for corrections and that sort of thing? Because it can be extremely distracting if you're reading a book that has wonderful content, but has so many typos that it just brings you down as you're reading it.
Yeah, that's a great question. Well, I'd say that I personally and VHS as an organization, we have high standards. So, if a manuscript came to us riddled with problems in the writing, we would have second thoughts. We would have to be really, really interested in the material and think that it was a really important book for us to publish, to want to put in the work to take that raw writing and massage it into what we think is even better than readable prose, good prose. But that said, once we choose to publish a book, we give it a solid editorial treatment. And typically I'm the person that does that work. So I'll be full of suggestions about if I feel like things in the text need to be reorganized. Those recommendations will get passed along to the author. We typically will do a thorough copy edit, looking for issues of grammar and syntax and typos. And, because as I say, we really want a high quality product that's going to be readable for people. So it's not part of a contract, but the Historical Society, when we decide we want to publish a book, we assume that cost of doing the editorial work, ranging from editing and copy editing through proofreading and indexing. We typically take on all of those costs as part of, as what we invest into the making of a book that we're interested in publishing. But I totally agree with you. It's the variability that you find in the quality of writing and sort of what makes it through any kind of review process before a book actually gets printed can be kind of surprising sometimes. And you want your work to be accessible to readers. You don't want readers to be frustrated or distracted because your book is filled with errors or problems in the writing, large or small.
Great. Tortoise.
Yeah, well, I will add as a publisher that as Alan and the Historical Society, that if you're a publisher whose name is on the book and that you stand behind it, it's your brand. Whereas there are an awful lot of publishers out there that will, actually, they're just sort of helpers, but they will only give you the help if you ask it for it and pay extra for it. And so there are a lot, getting a book into print is not the same as actually publishing it. That it, again, the change between the self-publishing, that it's very easy to get some words on a page, but when it comes down to what will the reader experience be, there's a lot that goes into it. And just to boast slightly, that to go back and look at the books that we published a long time ago, and I wouldn't choose a different title, and I wouldn't look at a different cover, because we really, really put the work in to know what's your message, who are you trying to get it to, and then how do you make that connection? What is necessary for the person, the reader, to get what you're trying to say? What do they bring to it that they might need a little deeper understanding, or some facts that they thought they had that you can gently provide something else? There's a lot that goes into publishing.
That's interesting to see Suzanne's sleuthing that she's done while we've been talking, that neither Boxcar and Caboose nor Northshire any longer have their espresso machines. That's unfortunate to know.
If you look at that article, it sounds like it revolves around one guy who was the driving force of the company, and
Of the espresso company.
yeah, and that lacking that, they've been losing ground and headed on their way out, it kind of looks like. But and there's nobody stepping in to take the void, which I really don't understand, because it was, the Harvard one was very well used.
Yeah. That said, these days, I would say the digital printers that I work with, you can get small numbers of copies of a 200 or 300 page book for anywhere from $2.50 to $5 or $6 a copy. So it's not, that's a good alternative to the fact that these other publishing platforms like Espresso may not be available anymore. It isn't that expensive anymore to use any number of digital printers out there.
So let me
to print small quantities of books. Sorry?
Because the difference for me is that, for printing, you always want to in what you're doing, you always want a batch of these. The Lemuel Haynes book I mentioned was less than $20 to, shipping, everything all included, for one copy, which was totally worth it for me. And I can't think of any. Printers tend not to do that, because there's all the, why would they? That there's all the setup, and so yes, if you're printing a bunch of them, I think you can go get quite cost effective these days.
Right. But a bunch could be as little as 50. Yeah, I mean, obviously the fewer in your print run, the more expensive it is. There's going to be a cost differentials at 100 copies, 200 copies, 300 copies, but you can go pretty low and still find a pretty affordable unit cost if a printer is willing to do as few as, let's say, 25 or 50 copies.
Another thing to think about when it comes to printing books is to keep in mind that the printing industry itself has consolidated quite a bit, and you might need to take into account lead times. I know for the Vermonters, we had, was it, Alan, maybe a month or two before they could, I think between when we submitted the order and when we finally had copies in hand.
Yeah, a month is a pretty normal turnaround at this point. The lead times were longer when pandemic supply chain issues were still very present. Now a month is pretty common.
Yeah, but that might also factor into your decision to, depending on where you go to print your books. There might be some that I have different lead times, so it's just another one of the many factors you have to take into consideration when you're ordering stuff. Usually, I would say, if you're printing a lot of copies, you definitely want to make sure you build that time into your schedule. Especially if you do end up putting together like a publicity plan, you want to make sure that, when the book is in hand, when you say it will be, so that, folks can buy it when the release date comes around.
Great. So we're a little bit over time. So I'm going to sort of give a call for one last question, comment from Andrew or Alan. And I will put in one little plug for book distribution. If the other avenue to kind of get the book out for us is through our library. So our library is a bit broader in what we like to have in our stacks. So we are often, the librarians are often getting every local history book they can find to put in our collection. So feel free, if you do have a book that's, especially some of the local ones, to let our library know as well that this is available, and they may be interested in putting it into our library collections as well. But yeah, any last minute tips or tricks from Alan or Andrew?
I'll just say thanks for your interest and keep up the good work.
Yeah, and as Alan said, his email's open for comments or questions. That mine are as well. If you have questions about the book selling process, or if you have questions about anything along the PR or sales route that I can help with, more than happy to answer questions via email. And you can find me on the VHS website pretty easily.
Great. Thanks again. Thanks so much, everyone. And again, our February roundtable is going to be on collections conundrums. So I think that'll be another lively and interesting discussion.